Well, hello again, everyone. A happy and relaxing weekend to all of you. I don't expect I'll get to relax this weekend for a while because I've got the sermon this coming Sabbath, but somebody's got to do it. All is well here in Tyler. The next 2 weeks are going to be hectic, getting ready for moving our office. By the way, I'm still looking for an excuse to get out of town, so if you have any suggestions, let me know. It's interesting watching the flow of downloads of this weekend Bible study. The average number was up this week to 415, but those participating are spread out all the way from this lesson all the way back to the beginning of it. And there are new people starting up all the time. But I guess because of time pressure, some people can keep up and some people don't quite. But that's okay, because what we have here is virtual togetherness, not a literal one. For example, Becky Hilbig of Westbrook, Minnesota, asks this week, "Dear Mr. Dart, why is it that Jesus told so many that he healed not to tell anyone? Thank you for what you're doing. For those of us out here alone, it is surely from God." That statement's one of the most common things I hear about this Bible study from people who are out there and don't otherwise have any contact. But anyway, Becky is going to come across the answer to her question in a later lesson, but that's okay. It's okay to ask questions like this, even if you think they might have been answered in a later lesson, and you just don't have the answer yet. For one thing, you may have an angle on the question that we didn't think about at the time. And if I know you'll be continuing to listen, well, I can just let you catch up with it. But on the other hand, I may want to write you back directly about it. Don't hesitate to ask because you're running behind on the lessons. Your question may not have been asked yet, and we don't want to leave it hanging. And for Becky, we can't be sure why Jesus did that, why he told them don't tell anybody, but I gather it didn't work very well because what he seems to have been about was to keep the crowds down to where he could move around. And the developing story in Mark demonstrates how hard that was to do because we'll keep coming up with illustrations of it as we read through the story. Cheryl Conrad writes again from Springwater, New York. "Hello, Ron. My question is, in Mark 5, where the unclean spirits were allowed to enter the swine and the swine ran over the cliff and were drowned in the sea, were the unclean spirits, demons, also killed? Is an unclean spirit also the same as a demon?" Well, yes, the New Testament writers use the expression unclean spirit as a synonym for a devil. Oddly, this is an odd thing when you stopped. I just looked at it this morning and noticed it. The King James Version doesn't use the word demon anywhere in the Gospels. That was a surprise. There they are devils. The Greek word is diabolos, from which we get diabolical. Demon comes from the Greek daimon, and a person possessed of a demon is said to be demonized, which I thought was rather a fascinating way of putting it. In fact, the idea of possessed of a demon doesn't occur in the Greek at all. This person is demonized, sort of like being Simonized, I guess, only much worse. Truth is, we are dealing with something here that, and by the way, there is no hint in the Bible that demons died with the swine. It's generally thought that demons, being spirit, don't die, although the argument goes back and forth in some quarters and has for a long time. Can the devil be destroyed or die, or is he immortal? The truth is, we're dealing with something that's revealed only slightly in the Bible, and we are left with mostly guesswork. One thing, though, was suggested by the Holman Bible Dictionary. The intense activity of demonization in the New Testament came about because of satanic opposition to Jesus. In other words, in a society, this demon-possessed person or this demonized person might sort of drift along for years. I think in many cases people would be aware of it, marginally aware of it, it wasn't that big a deal, or they just really weren't even there. But when Jesus came on the scene, it's almost as though he attracted satanic opposition, and that does make sense. But enough about that. You can send your questions or comments to me at ron@borntowin.net, and we'll try to either answer them in this Bible study or, if necessary, I'll drop you a note and give you an answer. Right now, grab a refill of whatever you're drinking, and we'll go right on with Mark chapter 6. After the death of John the Baptist, the apostles came back from the mission Jesus had sent them on. He'd sent them out 2 by 2, preaching and healing wherever they went. And they came back together again, and it's fascinating to me to think about that and imagine these men out there together on a trip like that. They must have gotten to know each other very well. I remember, for example, one time when Frank Brown and I were on a baptizing tour in northern England and Scotland. We went all the way to the Shetland Islands. And Frank and I got to know each other awfully well on that trip and got to be good friends, and that friendship has, well, it's sort of not exactly lasted, but we still are interested in one another, and I recently communicated with him upon the death of his wife, who was really a wonderful woman. But those trips like this, they are a bonding experience, and I know it had to be for these men just like it was for anyone else. But they came back to Jesus, and they all sat around, and they told him all kinds of things that they had done and what they had taught. Oh, what would you give to be able to have been there and sat and listened to, say, Peter or John and whoever the apostle was with them, listening to them teach? I would love to know what they said. But then I guess we know roughly what they must have said because we have their gospel accounts. But still, at the stage they were in right now, what was their authority? How did they explain things? What were the things they told these crowds that were important? Mark sails right over this. He just said they told Jesus what they taught and went right on. And Jesus said to them, well, come yourselves apart to a desert place and rest a while. Where there were so many people coming and going, they had no leisure so much as to eat. And I can believe that. When you consider the popularity of Jesus, when you consider the curiosity people had about what he was doing, that here is a healer, I mean, how far would you go? How far would you take someone that you love to him to be healed? And so consequently, it was just morning to night. I don't know how they found time to sleep, much less eat. By the way, the word desert in Greek is eremos, which means literally lonesome. I think what he is saying is, let's go away to a remote place and rest a while. Just get away from people. That's what this means. Why desert? Well, desert in our language says something entirely different. They departed into this remote place by ship privately, but the people saw him leaving. And many of them recognized Jesus, and they ran afoot there out of all the cities and outwent them. When they arrived the other side, people were already waiting for them on the other side. And Jesus, when he came out, saw all these people, and he was moved with compassion toward them because they were like sheep not having a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And what would you have given to have heard that? Well, I guess in a way we have, because even though Mark doesn't tell us here, we have the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. We have Luke's version of some of the things Jesus taught. We have what John wrote about Jesus' teachings. And so it's not as though we don't know. It's just that you'd kind of like to have been there, wouldn't you, to hear his words and hear what he says. And I'm very touched by the fact that when he saw all these people that he was trying to get away from, he was moved with compassion, not resentment. But this is a distinctive of Mark's gospel. Is he telling us what Jesus did, and he doesn't have an awful lot to say about what Jesus said. Well, when the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and says, look, we're in a remote place here, and the time to eat is past. Send them away so they can go into the country round about, the villages, and buy themselves some bread. They don't have anything to eat. And Jesus answered and said to them, give them something to eat. And they said to him, what do you want? You want us to go into town and buy 200 penny worth of bread and give them to eat? Actually, the NIV says 8 months' wages and give them to eat. He said to them, what have you got? How many loaves do you have? Go see. And when they knew, they came back and said, we got 5 loaves and 2 fish. He said, make them all sit down by companies. Let's get this thing organized. And they sat down in ranks by hundreds and fifties. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven, blessed, broke the loaves, gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and the 2 fishes he divided among them all. And everyone ate and was filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. And the people who ate the loaves were about 5,000 men. I can't even get my mind around this. The kind of crowds that would gather around Jesus. And this is in a day, no one had amplifiers. We didn't have loudspeakers. Jesus could probably not even be heard by most of these people. But they were able to organize them, sit them down in ranks, and they fed them. Now, why did Jesus do that? Because there are more important things than bread and fish. After all, they'd come out here to get away from the people. Now they're feeding them. If we were meeting together in class, I would ask you, what do you think about that? Why do you think Jesus did that? So why don't you stop the study right here and take a minute to consider your answer. What would you say was the reason why Jesus did this? If you're studying with someone else, talk it over. If you're on your own, sit down and write out your answer of why you think Jesus fed 5,000 people. Then come back and I'll tell you what I think. What I think happened here is just good hospitality. If someone comes to visit, it's customary to offer them something to eat, isn't it? If you have it. And if you think about it, Jesus had all anyone could want. I think Jesus fed them because he could. It's as simple as that. And it was a matter of good old Middle Eastern hospitality. It was the thing to do. Verse 45. Right away he constrains his disciples to get into the ship, go on to the other side before to Bethsaida, while I send the people away, he said. So he got the boys in the boat, got them underway, and he went off into a mountain by himself to pray. And when evening was come, the ship was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw them. I hadn't got very far away from him, I guess. He saw them toiling and rowing because the wind was contrary, and they were having a real struggle. So about the fourth watch of the night, he comes to them walking upon the sea, and he would have passed by them. Now, that's shocking in a way. I don't know why. I never noticed that before, that he wasn't walking to the ship. He was walking on to wherever they were going and was actually intending to just walk right on by them. But they saw him walking on the sea, and they supposed it had been a spirit. And they cried out. They were troubled. They were frightened by it. They thought they had seen a ghost. And immediately he spoke to them and said, "Oh, be of good cheer up. It's me. Be not afraid." And he went up unto them to the ship, and when he got there, the wind stopped. And they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and they wondered. For they did not consider the miracle of the loaves, because their heart was hardened. Now, I don't know what to make of that, really. If I was there and I had actually seen this happen, of course, all I would perhaps have seen was Jesus handing me a basket of bread and some fish in it. And I would have left and gone out and given that to people, come back, and I would have gotten another basket, and I took it out and come back. But sooner or later, it would have dawned on me, we had 5 loaves and 2 fish. What's going on here? And then when I was sent out with baskets to pick up all the fragments of it, I would have been stunned by what had happened there. And these guys were amazed that Jesus could walk on the water. And the implication here in Mark is they should have tumbled to something from the miracle of the loaves, but they didn't. For their heart was, to use Mark's word, hardened. Well, when they had passed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and got close to the shore. And when they were come out of the ship, straightway somebody recognized Jesus, and they ran through the whole region round about and began to carry about in beds those that were sick wherever they heard Jesus was. And wherever he entered, into villages or cities or country, they laid the sick in the streets and besought him that he might touch, if it were, the border of his garment. And as many as touched him were made whole. Everybody that was able to reach out and touch Jesus was made whole. You'd sort of think in a way that he could see that crowd and just wave his hand and heal the whole lot of them from a distance, but he didn't. For whatever reason that he didn't, He just carried along, and if they touched him, if they were to reach him, they'd be made whole. Healing followed him wherever he went. Okay, take a quick break, and then we'll go on with Chapter 7. You might want to take a file maintenance note. These files are named with the chapter of Mark we're starting in, not the number of the lesson. Thus, this one is Mark 6, dated March 7th, even though we're about to launch into Chapter 7 after this break. I'll be right back. Mark chapter 7. About this time, some of the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come up from Jerusalem, having heard about Jesus, I'm sure, when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with unwashed hands, they found fault. Now, I don't think this is just a question of that they had dirty hands. And it is strange to me that in view of everything Jesus was doing, his teaching, which was obviously affecting many people, his power to heal the sick, the feeding of crowds of people, with all the things they could comment on, they noticed the fact that the disciples, when they were eating where there might not have been any water to wash with, they ate without washing. And he went on to say they don't wash their hands before they eat because they were holding the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the market, except they wash, they don't eat. Many other things like this they do, which they have received to hold as the washing of cups and pots, brazen vessels, and of tables. They wash everything. It was a matter of the tradition that had been handed down. Mark uses the expression, which they have received to hold. And the whole idea in Judaism of receiving and passing on, this is the tradition of the oral law, or what is sometimes called Jewish law. Now, it's an open question I have as to why the New Testament writers never use the expression, the oral law, because it's extremely important in Judaism. I've been unable to determine whether that phrase was in common use in the first century or whether it was a later development. But in the Gospels, the use of the traditions of the elders is a reference to what is today called Jewish law or the oral law. Now, I discussed this at some length in the book Law and Covenant, and I've made it available for free download on rondart.com as a PDF file. It's an ebook, and you'll find it in the section of ebooks on my website. For your convenience, I've pulled out the chapter on Jewish law and posted it in the ebooks section of rondart.com. You'll see the link on the left side of the page. Please read that and offer any comments or questions you have by email to me, and perhaps we can discuss them later. I don't feel a need to go into them right here. But that's the distinction that is being developed here, and that is the Jewish tradition, the oral law, that these men were not behaving themselves like Jews. They weren't living like Jews. And the Pharisees and scribes asked Jesus, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat their bread with unwashed hands?" He answered and said to them, Isaiah has spoken correctly about you hypocrites. That's tough wording. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. And thus Jesus identifies and labels the traditions of the elders, the oral law, Jewish law, if you will, as the doctrines and commandments of men, not God. And he goes on. He says, for laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men like washing pots and cups and all sorts of things. And he said to them, full well, you reject the commandment of God that you can keep your own tradition. I don't know how those men were taking this. I can imagine their faces were getting red, their necks were red, their ears were red. I imagine they were angry. Because he says, Jesus goes on to explain, doesn't leave it lying there. He says, Moses has said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever curses father or mother, let him die the death. Okay, this is what Moses said. But you say, If a man shall say to his father or mother, it is Corban, that is to say, a gift, by whatsoever you might be profited by me, he shall be free. Now, King James is really awkward here. Most of the translations have it better than that now. But the issue is this. If a man's father and mother were in need, say, of money, and he has it, that they allowed him to say, well, I've dedicated this to God, and therefore, even though it might be good for you, then the man is free of his obligation to his mother and father. Now, one of the striking things to me about this is that the Greek word for honor, as it's often rendered, is a word that also is used for, what shall we say, an honorarium. That's where we get the term. A money that is paid to someone as an honor. And it's clear enough that God expects a man to take care of his mother and his father if they can't take care of themselves. And in fact, most of us are headed for a time of life when we're not going to be able to take care of ourselves. We may have money, we may not. And if you have children, those children have an obligation before God to help you. Or putting it the other way, if you've got mother and father who are poverty-stricken, if they do need your help, you're obligated to help them. Now, what's fascinating to me in this context is what Jesus seems to be saying. Your obligation to your father and your mother and to care for them comes before this matter of offerings or gifts that you may be planning to make to the temple or to this religious work or that religious work or to this preacher or that preacher. Okay? That you cannot neglect your mother and father and say, well, I've got to give this money to the church. No, you take care of your mother and father. And if you have anything left over afterwards, then you give that to God, the church, or what have you. He says you don't permit the man to do anything for his father and his mother, making the word of God of no effect through your traditions, which you have handed down, and many things like that you do. It's the tradition of the Jewish oral law, receiving, handing down, receiving, passing on. He called all the people to him, and he said, listen to me, every one of you, and understand this. There is nothing from outside a man that entering into him can defile him. But the things which come out of him, these are the things that defile a man. If any man has ears to hear, let him hear. Now that last statement, if any man have ears to hear, let him hear, seems to me to be an acknowledgement that some people just won't get it. No matter how well you explain it, no matter how often you say it, there's always those people that just will not get it. And Jesus is saying, hey, if you can hear this, hear it. But just to make the point clear, is Jesus here making arsenic safe to eat? Well, obviously not. What's he talking about then? Well, it seems to me it's obvious that when he's talking about defilement, he is not talking about physical defilement. Now, that's why when I read this, I think the food laws, as you read them in the Old Testament, are a part of the health system of Israel. The reason for them is not spiritual. It's certainly not eternal. It has to do with the survival of the body for as long as the old body will last. And they don't last all that long, do they? Well, when Jesus entered the house away from the people, his disciples asked him about that parable. And he said, you don't get it? You without understanding also, don't you perceive that whatsoever things from outside enters into a man, it cannot defile him, because it doesn't enter into his heart, but into his belly and goes out into the latrine, purging all meats. He means by that, purging all food out of the body. It just passes through. Now, when you understand what he's driving at, well, he makes it clear in the next verse, verse 20. That which comes out of the man, that's what defiles a man, because from within, out of the heart of man proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornication, murder, thefts, covetous, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within. These are the things that defile the man. Now, really, when I read this, I can only come to one conclusion. When he's speaking of defilement, he is talking about spiritual defilement, not physical defilement. This is not the occasion where Jesus says it's now okay to eat pork, He's not saying it's now okay to eat snakes and cockroaches and creeping things. Not at all. He is saying that taking things into the body, having a little dirt on your hands, is not going to defile you spiritually or religiously or cut you off from God or affect your salvation. It may affect your health, but that's not what we're talking about here. Jesus is not making arsenic and cyanide safe to eat, period. Well, from there he arose and went to the borders of Tyre and Sidon, and he entered into a house, and he didn't want anybody to know he was there, but he could not be hid. And again, this lies right at the root of this question that's been asked twice now. Why did Jesus tell people, don't tell people what I've done? And the answer to that, by the way, I think I'll just for a moment take a moment to explain something. There is a common point of view among people that the reason why Jesus healed the sick was so he could gather a crowd together to speak the gospel to them. I don't think so. I really don't. It seems to demean it in a way to me to make healing into a kind of divine advertising gimmick. That we'll heal a few people here, have big old shock, healing, revival, and when I get them here, I can preach the truth to them. No, I think the healings that Jesus did were all significant. They all had meaning, and that's one of the fun things to think about in this whole thing. Verse 25, a certain woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him, and she came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, Syrophoenician by nation, and she besought him that he would cast forth the demon out of her daughter. And Jesus said to her, let the children first be filled, for it is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it to dogs. Now, there's a real lesson in this. If this woman had been offended at that statement, and it certainly could have been taken offensively, as he's saying, what are you doing? You calling me a dog? You calling my child a dog? She didn't do that. If she had responded that way, her daughter would not have been healed. But she said, well, I understand, Lord, but the dogs under the table eat of the children's crumbs. And he said to her, for this saying, go your way. The devil has gone out of your daughter. And when she came to her house, she found the devil gone out, and her daughter was laid out on the bed. Well, he left the coast of Tyre and Sidon and came to the Sea of Galilee through the midst of the coast of Decapolis, all over this area. And they brought to him one that was deaf and had a speech impediment. And they besought him to put his hand on him. He took him aside from the multitude and put his fingers in the man's ears. And then he spit, and he touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And this is another example of Mark using the Aramaic word, following it with a Greek explanation. Straightway, his ears were opened, and he then, the string of the tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plain. He charged them, don't tell anybody. The more he charged them, the more the great deal they published it, and were beyond measure astonishing, saying, he has done all things well. He makes the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. But now, why would you stick your fingers in his ears and touch his tongue? That wasn't necessary. Jesus could have just laid his hand on the guy's head and said, be healed. He could have stood off 3 feet away and said, be healed. What's that all about? Well, it does seem that it's important that the contact be there, the symbolic act, which was what this really was. It was symbolic, putting his fingers in his ears and touching his tongue and so forth. Perhaps it was for the sake of the faith of the one to be healed, and for the one to know categorically that this was coming from none other than Jesus. It didn't just happen. That's the end of this chapter, and I'm going to save chapter 8 for next time. So once again, after this quickie, I'll be right back with the questions that we still have. Rita from Palmetto, Florida writes and asks, why are the holy days a month late this year? The Feast of Tabernacles ends October 21st, so very close to November. Thanks. Well, it's a peculiarity of the Hebrew calendar, I suppose, but when you think about it, have you ever noticed how Easter moves all over the calendar? Whereas Christmas stays put on December 25th. Well, the rules on establishing Easter actually, believe it or not, are connected to the Hebrew calendar, which is lunar in nature. A new month begins with the new moon. But I'll bet you've noticed that the moon does not follow exactly on the month of our calendar. In the case of our calendar, a new moon occurs about every 29 days. Well, in the course of a year, whenever we have 12 moons that have gone by, we're always a few days short of a 365-day solar year. What are you going to do about that? Well, the Islamic calendar does nothing about it. It's just that their Ramadan moves slowly throughout the year. But in the Hebrew calendar, because the holy days are connected to the agricultural seasons, and they are to be proclaimed in their seasons, you have to do some sort of an adjustment to keep them from moving completely away from the harvests. There's a connection there. So the way it is handled is that every so many years, and there's the people who make the rules for the calendar have set these, there's what's called an intercalary year. In other words, once in a great while, there is a 13-month year. Apparently, this year is one of those. So another month is added and throws the feast a good 29 days later. But what will then happen is over the next few years, the feast will move slowly back from that earlier and earlier in October. And then I don't think we ever end the feast in September. It seems like it always is over by sometime in October. But it's just simply a matter of an adjustment that takes place in the calendar in order to keep it in the seasons. We have an article on the website that explains why we use the Hebrew calendar, and I think I've also got a chapter on the calendar in my book, The Thread, God's Appointments with History. That's also available for free download in a PDF format from my website. I don't have the chapter, the appendix, on the calendar as a separate item up there, but you can find it anyway in that file. Rich Glasgow, I don't remember whether it's Dallas or Fort Worth where Rich lives, it may be somewhere in between, writes this week, Ron, I'm loving the series of programs on Samuel. That's what's playing on the air right now. Just finished listening to the last one that's up to number 10. I've got a question. In 1 Samuel 15, Saul wiped out the Amalekites except for Agag the king, whom Samuel had to kill, and did a pretty thorough job of it, as I remember. Then you come forward to 1 Samuel 30, where David slew yet another generation of Amalekites. How's that possible? If Saul wiped them out, weren't they all gone? Or does God count those who repopulated the land of the former dead Amalekites as being just as guilty? In other places, God says that sin has to be put out as it pollutes the land, as in fornication or worship of false gods. Is that the implication here? Else how could the Amalekites have repopulated if Saul wiped them out? Well, I have these three magic words that I always like to toss out. I don't know. But I will tell you this. I think Samuel is generalizing. It would be really unusual if in coming in and wiping out a people like the Amalekites, if they were all in one place to be wiped out. I think chances are there were Amalekites in the hills, Amalekites in the fields, Amalekites off somewhere else who did survive what Saul did and the judgment that God brought upon the Amalekites. On the other hand, Rich has a point. And that is, if these people moved back into the land of the Amalekites and continued to live with the culture that was there, then I can see how they might have been called Amalekites, even though ethnically speaking, they were not. There's a funny thing, too, in the Bible. We tend to always think in ethnic terms. I'm not sure entirely why. But in the Bible, a people are often identified, for good or for ill, by the God they serve. And the God has a great deal to do with the culture and the practice and the customs of the people. And inevitably, if a God is worshipped in a particular area, the people who move into this, who also worship that same God, are going to make the same mistakes the Amalekites did. And if they worship the God of the Amalekites, in an ancient way of speaking, they were some more Amalekites. I don't know if those are the answers or not. They are just my musings on what little I do know about what things were like at the time. People really were identified with the gods of the land. And this sort of connects up in a strange way with, that little segment in Daniel where Daniel has been praying and an angel comes to see him. And he tells him, when you started praying 3 weeks ago, I was sent immediately to you. But I've been fighting to try to get into here with the prince of Persia. In other words, there's some spirit being out there called the Prince of Persia. This is his territory, and I had to fight my way in. I had to have help from Michael to get in here. It's kind of spooky. You sort of think of men with these great beings with lightsabers fighting each other out there somewhere. I don't know how they fought. I don't know much about this, except that gods do seem to have areas of the planet that they deal with or people that they deal with. And so I suppose it's possible that a people moving into the region dominated by the Amalekite God would end up serving that God, affected by him, influenced by him, having their lives directed by him. Would that make some kind of sense? I think it possibly could. We don't know the answer to it, but either one of these particular approaches, I think, gives us an adequate answer other than having to decide that whoever wrote that later section of Samuel was making a mistake. Well, that's all the time I've got today. I'll be with you again next weekend, God willing, and we'll get on with Mark chapter 8 and your questions. Remember, I'm at ron@borntowin.net.